So I am a philosopher, and so as you might expect, I'm going to start off by raising puzzles and problems. So I'm going to begin by talking about puzzles concerning the nature of mind. Why is the mind philosophically puzzling? I want to talk about four sorts of features, characteristics of the mind that are prima facie puzzling, that seem to make mind mentality to be set apart from the rest of the world around us. So the first one you have here, philosophers often talk about the qualitative character of conscious experience. So think about a simple perceptual experience, conscious perceptual experience. You look at a red rose. Now, what is the surface of the red rose like? Well, you go to physics for that, and the scientists tell us it's a very complex surface structure that reflects light in certain characteristic ways, and that's what's responsible for that characteristic look that we have, a normally sighted human being, bright sunshine, looking at a red rose, okay? So it's a complex phenomena actually out there. The redness of the rose, that is that in the rose that's responsible for color, right? But in our experience, it seems very different, right? That is, our experience represents the color of the rose, and there's a quality to the experience that you have to have vision to grasp what that quality is. It's that simple, that look of redness, which is distinct from the look of blueness, which is distinct from the sound of a trumpet, other sorts of simple qualities of experience, right? So conscious experiences are constituted by qualities. There are qualities that are disclosed in conscious experience, and they seem very different from the kinds of qualities that science talks about. And again, there we go. Second, related to that, is the fact that we are aware of those qualities of our experiences. There's something it's like to undergo the conscious experiences that we do. We put this by saying that we are subjects, not merely objects, right? There's this relation of awareness that we have, and it seems to have distinctive qualities. Third, this is a little more controversial, but there seems to be something very distinctive about consciously understanding or grasping something, right? Conscious grasping of meaning, say, right? We now build technological devices. Steve talked a lot about technology, right? We all use computers that we've become very familiar with using the language of information processing. We say our computers are very sophisticated increasingly. They process information in ever more sophisticated kind of ways, and yet we do not think that our computers, this laptop here, grasps, right, what the information that it's processing, right? There's no conscious intentionality to the computer. This isn't to say, I'm not making a much stronger claim that you could never artificially construct something that does consciously grasp, right? But what it is to consciously grasp and understand something still seems to be it's not applicable to the devices that we now have. It's a puzzling what we're after there phenomenon. Okay, here I'm just in an impressionistic way trying to give a sense of the problems. And then finally, as people remarked in introducing me, I think a lot about freedom of choice. So we think of ourselves, perhaps naively, but we think of ourselves as actively and directly making choices among options, at least some of the time when our attention is focused on a practical problem of what to do, right? We make choices. And this seems like a kind of top-down exertion of control over our own behavior, okay? And that seems like an unusual. We don't think most aspects of the physical world around us engage in anything like conscious choice. Maybe animals do in non-human animals in simpler ways than we do. But this phenomena of conscious choice is one more aspect of mind. It's not about the so much the character of mind as the capacity. It seems like a distinctively mental capacity. All right, so that's puzzles about mind. But as has been noted, and that's part of what this conference is about, matter itself is puzzling. As we think about it, in fact, matter, from a philosophical point of view, seems more puzzling in the light of the advent of the modern physical sciences than it had hitherto seemed to people. Matter, right? Why should that be? Well, if you think about our fundamental theories about the world, they describe the material world, the composition and the behavior of the material world in theoretical ways. They ascribe qualities to the world, to fundamental bits of the world, maybe, or to the large-scale structure of the world that you cannot directly perceive or grasp, right? So you can perceive qualities like shape, right, of a middle-sized object, but not negative charge, or mass, or spin, or magnetic momentum. These are fundamental qualities that show up in standard basic physics, right? What are those qualities? If you ask a physicist, what is charge? Right? What you're going to be given is a description of how charge interacts with other qualities, how they co-evolve in terms of equations, right? This is how negative charge is some theoretical quantity that co-evolves with positive charge and with mass and spin in accordance with these dynamical equations. That is, it's telling you what negative charge does, what the impact of negative charge is in the physical structure of reality, right? But not what it is. Seems like we're given this picture of, it's a very structural characterization, right? But what are the qualities that lie at the root of this structure? The famous 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell, in his work, The Analysis of Matter, he used this phrase, the causal skeleton of the world, right? Saying that's what physics seems to give us. It's in some sense a skeletal picture. Right? And I think this kind of abstract, network diagram to kind of convey that idea that there are these distinctive kind of nodes in the material world, charge, mass, spin, and so forth. But we just know them in terms of how they're related. We're given a purely relational understanding. And the thought is, but what is their intrinsic nature, right? Something analogous to the intrinsic characteristic of shape, say, or the intrinsic character of conscious experience, right? The quality of redness, subjective redness in a person's experience. What corresponds to that when it comes to charge and mass and spin? We don't know. Physics is silent on that. It just tells us structure, dynamics, okay? So matter is puzzling. And then, finally, right, because mind, there are puzzling aspects of mind, and there are puzzling aspects of matter, there's the puzzle of how these interface, right? How is it that matter, conceived structurally and dynamically, smoothly integrates within a minded thing, such as ourselves or other sentient animals at least? How do these interface? Right? The way physical science, right, and even several steps up, going to neuroscience, the way that neuroscience characterizes the behavior of a living human brain doesn't seem to engage. It doesn't seem to truck in the categories of qualities of experience and relations of awareness that we use, or anything like the person exerting control over her own behavior, right? So how do we bring these together into a unified picture of people and other sentient subjects? Well, you might say, well, I'm not sure that I see a problem here. Why not standard materialism? That is, what I mean by that is, look, mind is just a special way that matter is organized. That's what I mean by standard materialism. Yeah, maybe we need to better understand what matter is, not just what it does, but mind is not a fundamental aspect of reality, right? This kind of more reductionist, materialist picture. Mind is just something that results in a smooth way from the ordinary operations of matter in accordance with the laws of physics. It's just when matter gets bound up in stable structures of certain kind, then you get these interesting coarse-grained patterns at the level of, human-sized scale. There's interesting patterns. You can talk, you can apply descriptions to human beings that are not purely physical descriptions. You can apply psychological, sociological descriptions, and so forth. So you get these interesting patterns. But all of this is fixed by matter being organized in certain ways, behaving in the same way that matter behaves when it's outside of those kind of organized contexts, right? When there's matter embedded in the floor of this podium, and so forth. Same old, right? At the fundamental level of description. That's the standard materialist view. And why think that this cannot be adequate? Well, one is just that structure and dynamics is never going to, by itself, give you qualitative character, right? So we're just not getting an explanation, right, by the standard materialist picture of how does there come to be qualitative character to our subjective experience. The looks of colors, the sounds of various auditory phenomena, and all the rest. These kind of inner subjective characteristics don't seem to get explained by simply pointing to organized structure and the dynamics that results thereon. I'll talk later about the other aspects of mind that I also don't think are getting captured in this standard materialist picture either. So, if we consider, cognitive science, the sprawling interdisciplinary attempt to try to get a unified understanding of cognition, cognizers like ourselves and other animals, if we wed standard materialism and we project into the future some extended, fully mature cognitive science, but if we're realist about consciousness, and so we say the qualities of conscious experience are getting left out of this picture, well, that's going to yield epiphenomenalism, what philosophers call epiphenomenalism, which is just the idea that somehow, right, conscious experiences that have these distinctive characteristics get kicked off by organized systems, but they don't do anything. They don't impact the way the cognitive system works. You may think that subjective experience of pain is what leads you to say, ouch, and move away from the source of your pain, right? But on this sort of picture, that would not be true, right? There's just neural machinery going on. It's doing its thing. It's leading ultimately to behavior in you. And then riding alongside, all of this are subjective experiences, right? And that's just a deeply implausible view, right? That it's deeply implausible on many levels, right? But one level is, why would the natural world give rise to purely epiphenomenal states that don't do anything, that don't have any adaptive value or anything like that? Another problem, you could take a different tack. So some people say, right, if you really took seriously this idea that conscious experience seems to disclose certain kinds of qualities that don't seem capturable in the physical network of explanation, then you would be stuck with either epiphenomenalism or saying somehow, the physical story would be incomplete. Those would be problematic positions. What we clearly need to do on this view is to just reject this conception that we have of our own this conception that we have that we grasp our own conscious experiences and their intrinsic character, right? And say this is a kind of an illusion. You think your own conscious experience is closer to you, right, so to speak, than anything else, right? That you're just immediately acquainted with it. Right now I see shapes and colors and relationships among, my representation of bodies in front of me. I think I'm directly aware of the characteristics of my conscious experience by virtue of which my mind represents to me what's happening right now in front of me. And then the claim is, this is actually just an illusion, right? What's really going on is you're a purely physical, cognizing machine, and for whatever reason, we have to figure out why, but for whatever reason, there's something about this, the nature of your machinery that it fosters this illusion that you're directly acquainted with the intrinsic character of the states that allow you to represent your own environment. But that's just an illusion. You're not actually primitively grasping qualities of your own experiences, right? Your experiences are neural states. These are highly complex physical states, and introspection doesn't reveal to you the qualitative character of neural states, right? Neuroscience isn't that easy, right? You just don't know about this stuff. But somehow you have the illusion that you have the illusion of being acquainted with the inside story, right? And there isn't one, right, on this. So this is a radical option that some people, Daniel Dennett is, in certain of his moods, is associated with this kind of view. It's just an illusion. But now this is complicated business, but if you think about how do we know about the world, our epistemology, our theory of knowledge, well, most of us think that much, if not all, of what we know about the world starts with our experience, right? Scientists begin with their experiences, and they communicate about them, and then they refine theories from there. But it's all rooted in experience. And if you say that at the foundation of our knowledge is a deep, pervasive illusion, that we have this direct acquaintance with our own experiences, and you say that's an illusion, well then you're going to have you're going to have to try to recover a story about how we know anything about the world if it's all founded at the very base on a kind of an illusion of direct acquaintance with evidence, right? Which is the evidence of our own conscious experiences, right? Okay, I don't know if that went a little too quickly. Think of it this way. You set up some standard little scientific experiment, some device perhaps that has a pointer that measures the magnitude of some result. Well, what's your most immediate evidence? Well, your most immediate evidence is, it appears to me that the pointer is, pointing over here, and so I write that down, right? That is, I have an experience as of this measuring device, right? And that experience seems to indicate to me certain things, right? And you say, what's that experience that you're appealing to here? And you say, well, the way it looks to me right now, right? This radical kind of illusionist view says there is no way it looks to you right now, right? That's an illusion, right? And if that's true, well then you've got to say, well then how is it that I learn about the world through experience? It's a complicated business. Steve's an epistemologist. We could say a lot about this, but I think there's potentially a real problem with going this route. Despite the fact that it just seems crazy, right? That that you might say, look, if I don't know that I'm aware right now of certain very palpable characteristics of my own experience, then I don't know anything, right? That just seems foundational. Right? And that seems like I start from there in trying to construct a conception of reality. Okay. So, one philosophical response to puzzles about mind and matter, as we've already talked about, we talked about last night, talked about earlier in this session, is panpsychism. Right? It's a literally radical view, going to the roots and saying, mind is embedded right down in the roots of reality. Steve talked about some of the figures. There's a whole bunch of figures in the late 19th century that talked about this kind of view. Shifting intellectual currents in the early part of the 20th century led to many people thinking of it as a very anti-scientific kind of view, kind of a more dominant materialism, so it got abandoned largely. There's been a small resurgence of interest in panpsychism, however. The older version was, of course, motivated by the problem of trying to understand the mind, but it was also, as Steve was intimating, connected to interest in a kind of an idealist pantheism or other kinds of speculative cosmologies, right? And what I'll call the newer versions, people in just the past couple of decades who've become reinterested in exploring panpsychism, are motivated by problems of mind and matter both, and not so much by these wider speculative kind of cosmological pictures. So many of these people will say, look, they're almost they're very much naturalist in their kind of wider conception of the world, but they say, but there is this puzzle about the mind and how it fits within what is fundamentally a material world, and so we're going to say there's this experiential aspect, because after all, science doesn't tell us about the intrinsic character of matter, right? So that's where we're going to hypothesize. That the intrinsic character of matter is something experiential or proto-experiential, and that's going to somehow ease our ability to understand how mind of the sort that we're acquainted with, our own minds, could emerge in the fullness of time in the material world. Now, there are options for restricting the panpsychist view. So one is to say, because one reason people didn't like panpsychism is saying, well, look, you're saying mind is everywhere, so, this clicker, this sheet of paper, this floor I'm standing on, right? You're saying it's a mind, it's a subject, everything is mental? Am I doing damage? Are there ethical issues with me stomping on this floor? It just seems kind of hokey, right? So one way to restrict it is to say, no, right? The fundamental elements of matter have a kind of, very hard to conceive, primitive, think of it almost proto, barely experiential kind of aspect. But then aggregates of that, like this floor, there's nothing it's like to be this floor. It's just an aggregation of those elements. And you only get subjects under special circumstances. So human and animal minds are also subjects, right? But we cut out, so we've got fundamental physical kinds, and then only special case organized systems that have minds. So that's one way to restrict it. Second way is, and some contemporary philosophers plump for this. We talked about neutral monism. Here's a variation on neutral monism. And that's to say, well, maybe we don't really want to say electrons have experiential states. We don't want to say negative charge is a kind of experiential quality. Let's say it's a kind of proto-experiential quality. That is, it's something vaguely analogous to experiential quality, but it's not like the electrons have a little subjectivity, right? There's nothing it's like to be an electron, strictly speaking, but there's something intrinsic, qualitative, that could possibly form the seeds or the building blocks of full-blown experiences in things like us and other animals, right? So it's not strictly panpsychism, it's, so sometimes it's called pan-proto-psychism, okay? It has the advantage that it can seem less bizarre, right, to your sober, standard issue materialist, right? You don't have to say that there are little minds or something like little minds, but you're saying something a little more chastened than that. The disadvantage is it seems like a something I know not what, right? When I slap the proto, I just say, well, it's not strictly speaking minds, but it's the kind of thing that could more naturally give rise to mind than the ordinary way of thinking about matter is, right? So it's really a kind of theoretical placeholder trying to find some kind of softened version of the doctrine. But you could go that route. And a lot of contemporary philosophers who are interested in panpsychism, they do end up saying something like this. Bertrand Russell defended a version of this. I talked about his book, The Analysis of Matter. All right, but I think for any version of panpsychism, whether you restrict it in certain ways, whether you go pan-proto-experientialism as opposed to a straightforward panpsychism, pan-experientialism, there are certain problems. First problem was talked about in the Q&A in the previous session. And that problem is, you might say it's, as someone alluded to, it's sometimes called a combination problem or a problem of grain. Certain of the qualities of our experience, I already talked about the look of a red rose. Think about, you look at a red rose, okay? Now, of course, a visual artist will tell you even something as simple looking as the color of a red rose, if you pay really close attention, there's gradations, there's shadows in your experience, right? There's some complexity there. It's not just simple, kind of thing. That's how it looks to me. I'm very visually unobservant, right? I don't have the eye of an artist. But thought is, zero in on a patch then of that rose, that is relatively homogeneous, right? It's got all more or less consistent shading, right? That's a part of a bigger visual experience that you're having, right? But zoom in on that little patch. You can get, you zoom in close enough, you're going to get a really simple quality, apparently simple quality, right? If you take your conscious, our beliefs about our conscious experience seriously, it's a very simple, how do you convey what that quality is? You can't convey it to someone who's never had sight, right? Think about what we try to do, right? You say to somebody who's congenitally blind, well, red is like the sound of a trumpet. Well, anyone who has both seen red and heard the sound of a trumpet knows that's a very, very poor, distant analogy, right? You just can't convey, right, what subjective redness is like unless you have vision, right? But it's a very simple quality, and it's different from the quality of a certain type of royal blue, say, right, or a bright green. These are all distinct, simple kind of qualities. Okay, so how does that relate to the panpsychist view if it's built up out of, whatever corresponds in the brain to that portion of your visual field is at a fundamental physical level enormously complex, right? You can take the smallest little portion of your visual field, that's going to correspond ultimately to billions of particles in some small region or probably distributed, region of your brain that is responsible for that portion of your visual field looking the way it does to you at that moment, okay? There's an enormous nested structure of fundamental physical entities that are at least causally responsible for that. Now, the panpsychist idea is it's not just causally responsible for it, it is it, right? All these fundamental experiential qualities together constitute that subjective look of red to you at that moment, okay? And then the question is, yeah, but how can that be? That's a simple thing. How can a bunch of very different elements working together constitute something simple? It seems like there's a simplicity to the quality at the level of conscious experience that is not being honored, you might say, in the panpsychist picture of things. Okay? The panpsychist says there's deep structure to that very quality, and that just doesn't seem to be the case. So prima facie, there's a problem. Second, related to that is our conscious awareness that we're having right now of our surroundings and of the thoughts that are going through your head. There's something it's like to be you. You are a unified subject. You, one individual, are the subject both of your visual experience right now, your auditory experience as you hear my voice, the thoughts that are going around in the background of your mind. All that comes together in a single subject, you. There's this single act of conscious awareness. And again, there's that unity to that relation of conscious awareness that doesn't seem to get captured in the panpsychism. It's not clear how panpsychism has the resources to account for that apparent characteristic of conscious experience. Conscious understanding. Here again, right? I will go back to the computer analogy. Computers process enormous amounts of information in a certain way, right? But there's no conscious understanding. The computer doesn't have a sense of what it's doing. It just does these things. It can be harnessed by us, right? So that we can come to consciously understand things by making use of the outputs of the computer. Okay, so conscious understanding. Also, it's unclear what the panpsychist story is going to be that's going to help us to kind of dissolve the seemingly distinctive aspect of conscious understanding. Similarly with free choice. Now here you can go. There's endless books written nowadays by people debunking free will. We don't have free will, science shows us this. You get neuroscientists, they usually have little puppeteer drawings on the cover of the books. It's a big little, it's a cottage industry going on. I think it's badly argued, claims that thing from social psychology and neuroscience claims we have direct evidence that we don't have free will. All right, so you can go that route. You can say this isn't a problem because there's nothing to be explained. But if you do take seriously the idea that we exert choice, right? Choice doesn't seem to be the mere resultant of myriad little non-choosing fundamental elements working together, right? Again, conscious choice seems like a fundamentally distinctive kind of action. It's a unified action of a subject. And panpsychism, just like standard materialism, right, would have it that conscious choice, like any other conscious phenomena, is a highly structured entity. It's built up out of myriad little bits working together that don't have that characteristic, but choice seems to not be subject to this kind of explanation. All right, so these are prima facie problems. I haven't, all right, in saying they're problems, I think they pose real obstacles to the panpsychist vision of things. What could be the alternative? Well, also in the late 19th, early 20th century, another competing idea that sometimes goes under the label of emergence, emergent dualism, was in vogue. It was quite fashionable. It too gets abandoned as anti-scientific in the early 20th century. So it seemed to many people, Steve mentioned some people, there were people like John Stuart Mill in his System of Logic defending an emergentist view. He's saying, look at chemistry, right? He said, you got physics, the physics they had of the day, and then you get chemistry, which seems like a very different order of things. And we have no notion of how to account for chemical properties, chemical order in terms of physics. Well, of course, in the 20th century, we get quantum mechanics, and we begin to get an explanation of chemistry in terms of fundamental physics. This is one of the reasons there are these empirical successes of seemingly straightforward reductionist science that seem to cut against the emergentist vision, right? The emergentist vision is, look, when matter gets organized in certain kinds of ways, boom, you suddenly get a whole new order of things. You get new properties, right, that are causally sustained by the underlying stuff, but they're irreducible in some strong sense, right? And they have their own primitive forms of behavior. You get chemical behavior, and then the idea is at the level of life, at biology, we get yet another new emergent layer to reality. But here again, with the biological the success of the biochemical sciences, right, the discovery of DNA and understanding of the biochemical basis of life, it no longer seemed like life was just this wholly separated new kind of phenomena that's merely causally sustained by the underlying stuff. It now seems to be just organized biochemistry or something like that. So it begins to get abandoned, but emergence has come back. So I think the much of at least the rhetoric of the people talking about sciences in the early to mid 20th century was very reductionistic. Quantum mechanics kind of success in reducing chemistry, development of mature biology. But then you begin to get in the latter part of the 20th century the resurgence of sciences of organized complexity and people pushing back and saying, no, there are certain kinds of organized phenomena that don't admit of a fully bottom-up understanding. Philip was talking a bit about some of this last night. So some of the people who talk about this right nowadays, who are all very distinguished scientists, Robert Laughlin, who's a Nobel Prize winning physicist, has this very anti-reductionist, emergentist vision. George Ellis, famous cosmologist, mathematician, recently wrote a book on this subject. Dennis Noble, a biologist at Oxford, wrote The Music of Life, talking about systems biology and how organized biological organisms exert top-down control, right? And all of these people want to say, in some sense, organized systems have to be understood as an interplay of bottom-up and top-down forms of interaction and behavior. So emergence is making a bit of a comeback. Now, in the older version of emergence, people like Mill and Samuel Alexander, several other people, George Henry Lewes, you kind of had this picture of kind of almost like a layered cake kind of conception of reality, neatly segregated strata, right? You get physical stuff that's everywhere, and then boom, in certain pockets, you get biological systems, right? And that's just a fundamentally different kind of thing resting on top of the physical. And then you get psychological, Samuel Alexander, you get deity up at the top, emergent deity, right? So it's connected to this kind of speculative cosmological picture. Newer version wants to say, no, we don't have these hermetically sealed strata to reality. We got interpenetrating causal influence going both bottom up and top down in a much messier picture, right? And the distinctively emergentist claim is just, it's not all bottom up. There's also top down, but you have to understand the interaction of the two. All right, so, fundamental problem that gets pushed nowadays by a certain kind of philosopher in circles I inhabit is to any kind of emergentist picture is the problem of causal closure of the microphysical realm. And so here too, look, I think we're going to be doing this all day today, as they were saying, in the previous session. So the idea is, look, here the claim is made. One thing we know is that the physical world, right, at its most fundamental level, when you get down to its basic dynamical principles, you don't have to go outside the physical realm to understand the fundamental physical realm, to understand any fundamental physical phenomena, right? There's no spooky forces coming down from on top pushing around electrons, right? You can measure the micro forces and magnitudes at play, and in principle, what we measure over here in an experimental setup and how these things co-evolve, the exact same things going on within a human body, right? Physics doesn't go all wonky just when physical stuff gets bound up in a body, a living organism. That's the thought, right? And so this appeal to top-down, suggesting that in some fundamental way, organized principles are exerting influence. If you took that idea seriously, their thought is, you'd have to say in some sense, some kind of macroscopic factor or force is pushing around fundamental particles, causing them to behave in ways they wouldn't, except if absent that special kind of force. And that's just crazy, people want to say. The microphysical world is causally closed. It's a complete, right? Physics is our only completely general science. It's operative everywhere. It's the fundamental science too, in that the higher level scientific phenomena depend upon the physical and not vice versa, right? So there's no, it has pride of place. In other words, it's back to bottom up.
Sorry, I don't know how this goes.
Somebody cheering on. Yeah, somebody, yeah. We haven't had the voice of the kind of, reductionist materialist now, so that's been interesting. I was waiting for that. Okay. So, my response to this, this is commonly claimed. It's interesting that among philosophers, or at least, the philosophical world that I inhabit, that this kind of view is very widespread. Philosophers are very intellectually conservative nowadays in certain kind of respects. It's a very dogmatic kind of view. And I want to say, look, how do we know that we're on to something with fundamental physics? Well, we know we're on to something with fundamental physics. I'm not a skeptic about that. Because it's got profound experimental verification, right? That is, but what kind of experimental verification do you have for particle physics? What do particle physicists do to confirm a certain model of, the basic physical constituents of matter and how they are elementally organized in our simplest chemical atoms, right? Well, what they do is they isolate very small scale particle systems in hermetically sealed environments,
precisely in order to exclude, complicating factors that you could not possibly track. It would explode, right? You'd end up having if you're trying to understand the influences on a single electron, you create these electron, vacuum chambers, right? That are, thick walls of lead, right? Composed precisely to keep out as much extraneous influence as you can. So you've just got a few elementary particles interacting, and then you observe how they behave, right? And you end up theorizing about their nature, their structure, and how they interact. It all works beautifully, right? Quantum mechanics is we're told, the most successful theory in the history of science, the most powerfully confirmed theory. But this is confirming that when matter is in its most decomposed, non-organized state, this is how things go, right? That's what you have direct evidence for. You directly verify that. It's a huge projection to say, and that's all there is. It's just that writ large, right? No matter what kind of embedded, organized context you're dealing with, it's just those same kinds of principles and nothing else, iterated over and over again, billions and billions of times over. That's all that's going on at a fundamental level. Well, maybe, right? But that's a huge, bold hypothesis, right? And what we cannot do, you cannot, focus in on, say, a living human or animal brain and zero in on a small, tiny portion of its brain and without destroying the creature, right? Focus in on a handful of particles in some cell in that creature's brain and then track, in quantum mechanical terms, all the causal influences on those particles, right? Which would be literally billions in its immediate environment, right? And then and then do the equations, right? Make a prediction of how those particles should evolve over a short interval of time, and then say, is that experimentally confirmed? That's a complete fantasy. You could never possibly do it. You'd have to track billions upon billions of particles, right? Because everything in the immediate environment is potentially impinging on that system. So we can't do that, right? In fact, we're told physicists don't even know how, even if they had no computational limits, which we in fact do have, if they didn't, if we whisked away the computational limits of our best computers, even if we imagine somehow we developed a technology for tracking billions of particles in real time and their interaction, which we don't have, but even if we imagine that, we don't even know how to apply quantum mechanics to systems of that complexity. Right? It's not a straightforward translation. People, they don't, even as a theoretical matter, we don't even know how you would do that, how you would write the equation. So I'm told. This is not my area of expertise. So the fundamental point here, we got 10 minutes. All right, good. Fundamental point here is just we, in fact, cannot and do not confirm that all that's going on, that anywhere embedded in your brain, the fundamental particles, they are simply being influenced at a microphysical level by other microphysical influences of the very same sort that we see in a decomposed context, right? Well, so given that we don't know that, right, we don't know that there are not fundamental top-down influences that come into play at certain points when matter gets organized. Okay, nearing the end here. But now, even so, even if you accept that and say, right, all right, it's really more of a kind of a stance, a microphysical bias that leads us to suspect something like that's not going to be true. It seems somehow to some thinkers that this idea that at certain junctures of organized complexity, suddenly there should come to be top-down factors exerting influence over what is otherwise a microphysical realm of behavior is just intrinsically implausible, right? They'll say, this idea that the universe is latent with a propensity to, in certain junctures, to pop out sentient beings that have these irreducible kind of qualities and exert top-down control over their own behavior just seems intrinsically implausible. something is going unexplained here. I think that this sense of a further explanatory gap is in fact related to our conference theme of consciousness, nature, and transcendence. That is, I think that people are misplacing why they're bothered by this picture and see it as somehow intrinsically implausible. If you think about, and the issue is really an issue about the kind of broader metaphysics that the scientific description of the world is embedded in. And if you have a kind of pure metaphysical naturalism on one hand versus any other kind of non-metaphysical naturalist, whether it be traditional theism or pantheism or even some kind of view that, anyways, a variety of views one might have that reject a purely metaphysically naturalist point of view. The thought is the science is the same regardless of which of those kind of overarching metaphysics you embrace, right? It's not a scientific explanatory problem if it just turns out to be that the world is not a simple Lego building block kind of picture where everything is just built up from the bottom floor up and everything is to be explained in structural terms, right? If it turns out that the fundamental elements of our natural world have the potential, when organized in the right kinds of ways, to give rise to top-down influences, right? That's, if we're empiricists, we should just say, okay, that's one way. It's possible, it's conceivable. So it's an empirical question whether the world is in fact that way, right? So your science is going to look the same either way. But what differs, it seems to me, is the kind of conditional probability of how likely the world, that kind of strongly emergentist picture of the world is on different background metaphysical schemes. That is, the probability, the way you read that is, the probability that the world should turn out to have this kind of emergent dualist character on naturalism, assuming metaphysical naturalism, is less than the probability that the world should turn out to be that way on theism. Why? Well, it's less surprising if truly fundamental reality on traditional theism is God, right? A personal reality par excellence, right? Then that God should give rise to a world that has this kind of latency for sentience and ultimately personhood is not terribly surprising, right? It's sort of what you might expect, right? On naturalism, it's just, well, there's different ways fundamental matter could be in a metaphysically naturalist view of things. Science is about the business of trying to discover the way it actually is. And it just seems like most of the time you would expect a kind of boring kind of conception of the world if naturalism were true. There's something like that kind of implicit thought that if naturalism is true, emergent dualism is far less likely to turn out to be the case than on theism. But if one is convinced on, kind of broadly introspective grounds, on our own acquaintance with our conscious states, that subjectivity has emerged, and it is fundamental, it cannot be accounted for in a bottom-up structural kind of way, whether a panpsychist way or the way of standard materialism, then one has data here for a kind of fine-tuning argument for theism, right? It's or at least an argument against naturalism, right? Because if we replace theism with just some element of a purposiveness to reality, right? Whether it be theism or pantheism or some kind of undetected natural purpose that atheist philosopher Tom Nagel thinks we need to plumb for. Something, it's just a disjunctive grab bag. It's just an anti-naturalist. Then, again, the likelihood of emergent dualism is higher there. And so in a sense, it constitutes a kind of evidence, given that if in fact we take it, that's what we do observe, right? Consciousness is real, right? It cannot be neatly explained in a kind of reductionist way, okay? Well, that becomes a bit of evidence in favor of that type of broader metaphysics as against naturalism, if you regard it as intrinsically implausible. So if you're a naturalist, I guess what I'm saying is, number one, your naturalism, your metaphysical naturalism, should not be a kind of premise, right, that you start your theorizing about the world from. If anything, if you're a metaphysical naturalist, it should be the result of reflection of what we know about reality, right? It should be a conclusion about what's the most plausible, overarching metaphysical framework, right? And if you regard, and you have to be careful then, not to say a certain way of thinking about the place of human beings within the world don't fit well with the kind of metaphysical framework that I'm inclined to endorse. Well, maybe that's just evidence, right? Rather than deny the phenomena, deny the data, right? You need to adjust your metaphysical picture. Or you could just say maybe it's not so implausible even on naturalism after all, that'd be so. You know, that's an option as well. And I think I want to end there. So thank you. Yes.
Hi, and thanks so much for this
Okay.
talk. I have a question, I think, about the disjunction between panpsychism and emergent dualism.
Okay.
So I was tracking the difference you were sketching between the two positions until the very end. So at the very end, you say that you could combine, in a certain sense, emergent dualism with just the general notion of purpose, and you have there then pantheism as one way to cash out the sense of purpose that could make emergent dualism
Right.
plausible. But I mean, if the Deus in pantheism is a kind of personal God, then wouldn't that be a kind of pan-personalism, a certain sort of panpsychism already, right? So if we have pantheism as a plausible, I guess, theological framework to understand emergent dualism, that is a kind of panpsychism. So then what would be the difference then between those latter sorts of theological options you sketched and the panpsychism that you think contrasts with emergent dualism?
Okay. Yeah, and this is related to Steve's different way of thinking about it. All right, this just shows, I should have adjusted. Steve's thinking, he's got a wider frame, he's seeing a wider range of possibilities. I've been focused on kind of contemporary discussion of panpsychism, which kind of sees it as a bottom-up kind of thing. It's pan as in each individual element has a kind of psyche. And I wanted to say, that I don't think is entailed by pantheism.
Right, sure.
Right. So that kind of panpsychism isn't automatically pulled once you go, So if you're a pantheist and you say, in some sense, the totality of reality viewed under the right aspect is divine, is God, right? Is in some sense conscious, or at any rate, aware, purposive, something like that. That doesn't entail that you think each and every, it's built up out of, if anything, that kind of view tends to be a really strong holism, right? Of saying, in some sense, the whole is explanatorily prior to the parts.
Yeah. So it's like, so in some sense, the sort of emergent dualism you were sketching would be compatible, you think, with the kind of holistic panpsychism?
Yes, sure. Sure. So good. I should have been a little more careful about that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your talk. I think that was a really clear explanation of one of the hardest things to understand, the whole field of consciousness in general, so thank you for that. So my question was about the very last part of your talk, when you're talking about the causal closure problem. So forgive me if I didn't understand. I know it's hard at the end, but so we're talking about how the equations of physics could be controlled top down, and you're saying, well, maybe it doesn't work like that. Maybe it's more of the Cartwright picture, like this dappled view of laws and everything. But I kind of have this hunch that at the end of the day, the pictures, the fundamental laws will be preserved in some way, and that kind of these higher levels of science, these more meta levels, would kind of build on in some way. I know this is, I'm having trouble articulating, and I think it's hard to articulate in general, but do you think that these fundamental physical laws, the quantum realm are kind of thrown out in certain situations, or are they?
No. So I think I'm on the same page with you, and that probably, it all went by very quickly because I was just kind of waving at a broadly anti-reductionist kind of picture. But no, yeah, I think fundamental physics still holds, even within the living human brain. That's my, right? It's not this kind of Aristotelian picture, when you get the form of the whole, the bits disappear, right? It's just the whole, right? It isn't any longer composed. No, cells are still there, particles are still there, they're still obeying laws of basic physics. The idea is you've got new, I'm trying to put it broadly because there's different ways you could think of this, but new explanatory principles that are fundamental principles that supplement, but don't in any sense override the fundamental physics, right? Think of it this way, so one way of doing basic physics, you calculate all the forces coming to bear on some small scale system. You calculate the so-called Hamiltonian, right? All the influences that that you think are being brought to bear, and then you calculate how that's going to that system is then going to evolve in the light of that sum total of causal factors, right? But that's an open-ended calculation, right? And if it turns out we've got a new additional feature, it's in effect, it's kind of being added to the mix. There's an openness to that in the way physics is conducted. I mean, a physicist might presume there's nothing else, even when you're talking about the physical particles embedded in a brain. That's a philosophical assumption, right? That's not directly empirically confirmed, but there's nothing else fundamentally influencing what's happening with the particles that constitute the human brain. There's no kind of top-down principles that supplement, not override or negate the physics. But that's how I'm thinking about it.
Great, thank you.
So my question is about the very last bit of your talk.
Okay.
So where you were talking about the probability of emergent dualism given naturalism being less than theism. So I'm wondering, and so you said, okay, well the reason is that emergent dualism would be less surprising given theism as compared to naturalism. So I'm wondering if it depends on what you mean by naturalism. So if you're a naturalist who takes consciousness seriously and is convinced by kind of anti-reductive arguments that consciousness can't be reduced, then it seems like you've got what you need to make it unsurprising. Like you've got, we have these experiences, we have persons, we have at least experiences of agency. And so, on that sort of view, it would be unsurprising if there's emergent dualism. And so I'm wondering if a view like that, like a non-reductive naturalism, would be on similar footing to theism.
Good. And this makes clear to me that all those last couple of slides went way too quickly. So the idea is something like this, how should you evaluate rationally, competing metaphysical schemes? Well, one way you might do it is say, think of it kind of, broadly analogous to the way we evaluate the relative merits of competing scientific hypotheses, right? And one way we do that is we gather data, and we say that insofar as our data fits with, it's not surprising on a given hypothesis, then that provides some confirmation for that hypothesis. And to the extent that something we observe is deeply surprising or not to be expected, it's not what the theory would predict, we would say that's disconfirming. And of course, it's always an ongoing discussion because there's always new data, right? There's no silver bullet that settles the matter. It's just a matter of this bit of data, does it confirm this theory more than it confirms that? Okay, so that's the kind of framework. So it's an ongoing discussion. There's a whole lot of things that you might bring to bear when you're debating between, say, metaphysical naturalism and classical theism. Problem of evil, you might think, is a lot of data pushing in the other direction. It seems very surprising that there's unjust suffering in the world on theism. Okay, that's the kind of framework that I was kind of in the background there. But the question is how do we assess these conditional probabilities? And the thought is supposed to be, you have to prescind from what you actually know about the world we're actually in, right? Because yeah, you might say, we know we're conscious, so far from being surprising, it's exactly what we expect, right? But the thought is, no, we're asking ourselves kind of a priori, what's the conditional likelihood if all we're told about our reality is it's a closed physical system. Try to come up with the most neutral way of characterizing metaphysical naturalism. There's a physically composed, organized system of a certain magnitude, and it's impervious. There's nothing, supernatural, something that transcends this realm that influences what happens here. That's your metaphysical naturalism. It's all of reality is constituted by this system. That is not, if we're metaphysical, the way I'm using metaphysical naturalism, it's precisely not pantheism or anything like that. So it's an impersonal, fundamentally impersonal reality. Okay, and then you say, how likely is it, do you suppose, a priori, that in a world like that, you would have, under certain little pockets here and there of tiny portions of this overarching reality, there should be these emergent, organized, self-aware systems, right? That where that's understood to be irreducible in some ontological sense to the underlying stuff. These new primitive kinds of states and qualities that are caused by and sustained by the organized stuff underneath, right? But how likely is it that system is going to be like that the fundamental elements have this potential to give rise to new fundamental principles and states? And the thought is, I'm taking it that part of the reason many metaphysical naturalists reject emergent dualism is they have the thought that that's really improbable. It's not impossible, right? We can't say a priori it's impossible the world could be like that, but it just seems so improbable. They seem to think that on metaphysical naturalism, far more likely that the world is just elements and structure. It's all bottom-up arrangement. I don't know, how do you come up with that estimate, this a priori? You might be skeptical about this. I'm a metaphysician, so I have greater confidence in my ability. It's a kind of self-selecting problem. You become an epistemologist if you're very suspicious of people's ability to assess these kinds of a priori conditional probabilities. But at any rate, insofar as you think that seems really unlikely, or even, you don't have to say like super unlikely, just rather unlikely, okay? On theism, it's not so. If you say, there is this reality, okay, this physical world, an elegant system, it all works together, it's fundamentally impersonal. But in addition, there's this personal reality that gave rise to that consciously chose, in a classical theism, to create this realm. Now, how likely do you think that here and there, pockets here and there, you're going to have emergent conscious awareness? And you might say, that's a valuable, thing. Here's one reason, that would be creatures that are, in some sense, in the image of their creator, right? Yeah, it kind of seems a priori, at least not surprising that a creator would go for a world that had that potential. That's an interesting world. That's a world that has enhanced value, where personhood emerges. And so then you say, and lo and behold, we're in a world like that. That's some evidence in favor of the theist hypothesis. Other evidence might push the other direction. It's not any kind of proof, right? It's just data. But that was the thought. So you can't use the fact. So the final thing to say is you can't use the fact that you're already persuaded that in fact our world is the emergent dualist world, and then feed that back into your naturalism and say, and so therefore I embrace a kind of naturalism that says that's not unlikely, right? It's kind of, no, you're supposed to, your naturalism is supposed to be a hypothesis that can be responsive to evidence, right? And so you can't build into that generic metaphysically naturalist hypothesis specific information about our world, right? Because then nothing about our world can render it unlikely, right? If you built it into the very hypothesis. Do you see? I can see we're going to need to follow up on this, but I will.
I actually respond. I can talk very
Okay.
First, so a comment and two questions. The second one has to do exactly with what we were talking about. The comment is, it seems surprising to me that you would say that this emergence you're discussing is a small resurgence. Given so much that's happening in biology, it seems that it's widely discussed, whether you're talking about systems biology or epigenetics or ecosystem studies. So that doesn't seem accurate, not only given the literature, but given the science. The first question is,
Can I just briefly say about that? Emergence is a highly contested word. And yes, well, and it's used in the concept. There's more than one concept of emergence.
Yeah, we'll find out.
And I would love for it to be true, given that I'm very favorable, as you now know, to a rather robust kind of emergence, with irreducible principles, top-down influences, that kind of thing. When I look at what scientists, some systems biologists, sometimes these people are unclear because some of them seem to me have a weaker conception of emergence. All they mean is, no, you can explain phenomena in a robust way, even if you don't know anything about the physics. There's a kind of explanatory autonomy.
That's merely verbal. I got to get to the hard
Okay, I just wanted to get that out there. And many people who may sound like my allies may not actually be my allies.
Yeah, we don't agree on that. The next one is, why do you want to call it emergent dualism? It's emergent dualism only if one thing emerges, which is mind. But if there are multiple levels of emergence, as one author gave us 29 levels, but even if there's life emerging...
That can't be right. Maybe 32, but 29.
So the dualism I find highly misleading. Can you let that word go? How about emergent pluralism?
Yeah, good, yes. I only use that to emphasize that the kind of emergence I'm interested in really does want to say there are kind of fundamental mental qualities that are ontologically distinct, that are not merely organized ways for matter to be. Sure, right.
So already we have three, so we're not dualistic.
I'm with you. Yeah, it's just we've got all kinds of terminological problems, and dualism has emerged as this word in philosophy just for the view that
because we lose a lot of scientific allies if we sound like dualists where they read Descartes or something like that.
You're more used to talking to deeply interdisciplinary audiences than I am, so you're much more attuned to this terminological issue. So I take your point.
The last thing is a beautiful question that was raised earlier, and that makes me wonder whether, well, you should restate your response. I want to build on you and not take your words away. So,
you want to give a quick restatement?
No, I think we answered your question, but you wanted to answer back, and I feel badly sort of putting words in your mouth.
Okay, I have limited time. I mean, I guess the quick response is. Thank you. The quick response is just like if we think of consciousness as part of the natural world.
Yes.
Like it seems to maybe stack the deck if we think of naturalism as meaning like building from the bottom up.
So now I can build directly on that, which is when you say given naturalism, given theism, you put them in there as if they're equal choices. But it would seem to me that if you're taking some area of study of the natural world, then the framework that lets that knowledge emerge, that lets that data emerge, is not the same as the framework that says there is a personal God who exists in three persons and created the world. To put those, it's an epistemological question, put those on the same level seems suspect. Wouldn't you want to start with, as we call the adjacent possible? The next thing over, if we look at some description of the data, is a broader, call it methodological naturalism. You got to work through that before you say, well, given theism, which is a broader, more abstract metaphysical frame.
Okay, good, yeah.
You do is planning that does that, sort of set them side by side and say which is more plausible. But I don't think you get to just set those two side by side in the middle of a discussion about emergent complexity.
What I meant by naturalism is it's a metaphysical doctrine about all of reality, right? It says there is the cosmos, maybe multiverse, but there is this impersonal, fundamentally impersonal physical system, and that's all of reality.
Okay.
It exists, it exists, and it doesn't derive its existence from anything more fundamental. There's nothing supernatural that influences what happens within that domain. That's a metaphysical
I
hypothesis.
understand, and that's what we're disputing. So if I understand my friend, we're saying that what you actually get are a variety of different ways of thinking about the natural world. Naturalism in the most narrow sense, reductive, naturalism in a somewhat broader sense, one that can study mind. Naturalism extended as far as it can go. That's a more responsive metaphysics, one that, as you say you want to do, listens to the data about natural systems, and then says, let's try to reconceive and broaden our naturalism. It's not arbitrary, because at some point we hit a limit.
Yeah.
But you can't just force onto us a sort of given metaphysical position and not let it be responsive to the data as it arises.
Sure, but I was just, think of it as a kind of, decision tree, a very generic position, metaphysical naturalism. It doesn't say whether there is conscious life within it or not, or if it's emergent or not, right? It's just a view about the totality of reality. What is fundamental reality, right? The cosmos or the multiverse as a whole, nothing else. It's a metaphysical doctrine, right? Epistemological, kind of methodological naturalism is totally independent of that. You can think the proper way to investigate the world and even to theorize about metaphysics is some kind of deeply naturalistically, methodologically constrained activity. That's the best way to do it. But that's not committed to any claim about the nature of reality.
I've got to let Andrew to the mic, but that's a really, really important point, and I have a strong disagreement. I hope theism is responsible to advancing knowledge in the world.
Sure.
So I think we read Genesis 1 differently after understanding about evolution. We have theistic evolution as a view. If that's true, and it ought to be true that theism responds, then it also ought to be true that metaphysical naturalism doesn't become a timeless view, but is continually evolving in light of our deeper understanding of the world, which I think was where her question was going. And that changes the whole discussion if we have evolving metaphysical positions in dialogue with data.
Okay. I'm not sure that I disagree with that, so I'm going to let it pass for now. Go ahead. Please.
Okay, so I just want to return to the original concept. I thought we were going to hear something about the metaphysics of free will.
Yeah, I just threw that in there. So just to flag it, because sometimes that doesn't get discussed when we talk about the relationship of mind and matter. But go ahead.
Well, in the whole discussion about causality, whether it's bottom up or top down, the notion of free will kind of got lost.
Yeah.
For me, anyway. I can't find a notion of free will in your structured approach to the problems that you outline.
Yeah.
That's, in your words, intrinsically plausible. I don't find it. The notion is intrinsically implausible for me.
The idea of free will.
The way, yes, the notion of free will is implausible. The way you outline the structure of reality, whether it's bottom up or top down.
Okay.
So, would you say something more about where free will fits into this picture?
Yeah. So, phenomenologically, one might say, how it seems to us when we act. It seems to us that when we're consciously attending to some practical matter to be decided, and there's something to be said, from our point of view, for more than one option, right? But we have to choose, right? It seems to us that at the end of the day, we settle the matter. We settle upon, we decide which of, perhaps competing values we are going to, on this occasion, give more weight to, right? So it seems like we exert as a unified subject, consciously settle. We move from uncertainty to action, right? Practical uncertainty to action. And we directly control that process. We exert a capacity to choose. It seems to us like we have this capacity to form choices, to intend to do things, right? In the face of competing alternatives. And it seems to us that we might have chosen any of the alternatives that we were contemplating at the time. So there seems to be an openness to alternative possibilities. That seems to be I'm just describing how it seems to us, right? You could say this is all an illusion, right? But it seems to us that I really could do A or B or C, right? And I simply settled the matter. I chose B. I had reasons. It was a purposive activity. It was motivated by reasons, but I also had motivations that were inclining me in a different direction, right? And I might have acted on those. So that's just a kind of how it seems to us, right? You call that free will. It seems to us we have free will in that sense. We're free to choose, right? We really, given all the factors being brought to bear upon us, it was open to us still to go this way, or this way, but it's not random that we go there. We're not saying it's just uncaused. We decided, we settled the matter, right? We resolved our own uncertainty. We caused our own intention to act. So that's the idea of free will. So that's a top-down, purpose-governed kind of control of a system, of a person, an organized system over its own behavior, right? Where it might have gone in a different direction. That's the idea of free will. I think it's fundamental to the way we think about human beings, the fact that we live in communities, we hold most adult, mature human beings responsible for their behavior. It's implicit in that whole practice that it's hard to imagine human society being organized in a way where we didn't hold one another to account in that way. Implicit in that idea is individuals make choices, sometimes for good and for bad, and they're aware of the alternatives. They're sensitive to moral considerations. They're aware of those, and they made their choices, and so we can hold one another to account for our behavior. Many people say as a theoretical matter, they reject it. They think, right, no, everything's driven by ultimately unconscious factors that you're not really aware of, and these are actually settling, resolving how you choose. But then take those same theorists, put them back out into the real world, right? And they express moral attitudes, right? And moral reactions to behavior. It's built into us to conceive our social world in terms of responsible agents who interact in certain kinds of ways. So I think it's very, I don't think we can shake it as a fundamental matter. That claim is consistent with claiming that in fact it's an illusion, right? Even if it's an unshakable illusion. But my general stance is we ought to take the world as it seems to us, absent compelling reason to think otherwise. So I think it's innocent until proven guilty to think this is in fact veridical, right? Of course we learn things. We don't have quite the level of control that we sometimes might assume. We know that, right, from the social sciences that study human behavior. We can be deceived in various kinds of ways about some of our own motivations. But all of that just points to limits and fragility, right, to the way we exercise control over our own behavior. In my view, if you look at all what we're learning from the social sciences and from neuroscience about human behavior, it's not showing us that we're completely mistaken in thinking that we ever directly control our own choices. So, I don't know if that answered your questions. Yeah.
Take 2 more questions.
All right. Do we go to this side first? Okay.
Following up on free will.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the free will theorem that has been developed by 2 scientists at Princeton University, which basically says that if humans had free will, then everything does. In other words, this is how I understand it. John Conway is the mathematician and physicist, that you cannot have humans having free will and then other things not. In other words, it has to go all the way down, even to the smallest particle. Some degree of choice is being made, some, even however prototypical that might be, but it's some level of freedom is even happening at that level.
Yeah, I don't know if that's that captures what's going on there or not. I'm a little unclear. I've looked a little bit at this. I haven't actually
I've actually talked to John Conway.
Okay.
Had like hours.
Yeah, but I worry. I think sometimes when scientists scientists fuss about scientific words in the context of scientific theories, being very precise. Philosophers fuss about philosophical words in the context of our little pet theories, kind of sort of thing. But when a scientist talks about a philosophical notion, sometimes they can talk very loose and sloppy, just as philosophers opining on matters of science that they're not deeply trained in the sciences might talk sloppy. And so I think they're talking a little sloppy there when they say something like, well, if human beings have free will, then even fundamental matter makes choices. When I think all they mean is there has to be a causal leeway, there has to be an indeterminism if there to be the possibility of human behavior, exercising choice among among alternatives that's left open by this leeway. If that's all that's meant, great. I get nervous when they say, so therefore electrons are choosers. Because why? Because they act non-deterministically the way they evolve. I would say, no, they're not even, they have no purpose. They have no goals. They're not minds, at least, on the standard conception. So they don't exert choice at all. There's no will there, right? Yeah, but, okay, that's a claim, and I'm not going to dispute John Conway and his expertise, whether he's right that the physical world has to be structured that way. But it's a priori, but maybe there's a failure of imagination or understanding on my part. It's not obvious to me that even if the world evolved deterministically initially, when it gave rise to emergent phenomena, that a kind of indeterminism couldn't emerge only at that level. It's not obvious to me, but maybe I don't appreciate the way physical theory constrains.
Okay, our time is up. First, I know we have one outstanding question. Please save it for the panel this afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Tim for a very fine